post pictures as soon as we get it put up. All right. So we're going to start today part 2 of the book. And the second part of the book is called Transnational Networks. So the first transnational network that we're going to talk about had its origins in France in the 1950s. A guy by the name of Jean-Paul David, and we're going to talk quite a bit about him. But Jean-Paul David had created a poster, and his poster had the words, "The dove that goes boom." In other words, they're dressing up like a dove, but it's actually an explosive. So that's obviously a very telltale sign. And it ensured the notoriety of a network that had been set up of French anti-communist that was the Pole Liberté. Okay. Bridget, can you still hear me? I think they just crashed the site. Hold on just a second. All right, let's try that again. So, okay. We'll try it one more time. All right. Let me bring back Bridget as the co-host and Stellar as the co-host. Okay. We're going to try this again. All right, guys, we're going to try this one more time. We will not be defeated. All right. So, again, setting France, 1950s. Jean-Paul David creates a poster that says, "The dove that goes boom." And it is part of a network that was called the International Committee for Social Action. And there's the French words, but that's basically what it means. It's CIAS. And it was set up in 1956. Throughout the decade, it participated in American psychological warfare campaigns and mobilization of Europeans into an anti-communist cause, mixing covert action with open propaganda, which of course is Operation Gladio. The Pole et Liberté was first and foremost a two-dimensional state-private network. At the national level, the agents from the civil society joined forces with the state to fight against the quote-unquote communist. At the international level, the US and other powers used the organization, to include NATO, and their wider networks to wage psychological warfare during the Cold War. There were two factors that gave Pole Liberté organization a transnational dynamic: its anti-communist purpose and its determination to act in ways that went beyond national frameworks. It therefore provided provides insight into the continuities and changes in anti-communist activity after 1945, as well as transfers and circulations in time and space in terms of people, practices, means, and influence. It was not necessarily a smooth process, but one they were dedicated to ensure worked. Due to lack of resources, the exact circumstances and dynamics behind the creation of it remained uncertain. And let me just clarify that, because this is one author. It was very certain where the money came from. The money came originally from the Marshall Plan and the Rockefellers. Paul Williams tells us that. So does Danielle Ganser, and many other books that talks about this operation. According to one scenario, and again, this guy, and I've noticed this a lot. The book that I read this weekend, same thing. The book that I read this weekend, Kevin Shipp, CIA guy who they tried to kill, by the way, the CIA tried to kill him and his family, still gives people the benefit of the doubt when it comes to very logical conclusions that you would draw based on the evidence as it's laid out. So this guy goes, basically, I don't know how it got funded. However, the network constituted a sort of quote unquote Operation Gladio of propaganda. Well, then that would mean that it got the money from the same place, which is the CIA, from their drug sales after the original seed money from the Marshall Plan. It also was orchestrated by the secret services with the CIA at the head. And technically it was NATO, but all of their intelligence organizations were part of it. At the end of the summer of 1950, two associations emerged in France and in the Federal Republic of Germany that seemed to have little in common except their name. Po et Liberté, which stands for peace and freedom, and the Volksbund für Frieden, or Freiheit, which was abbreviated VFF, or the People's League for Peace and Freedom. So in other words, it was the same thing. The creation of the former in France owed much of the action to the then Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Defense, René Pleven, whose interest in psychological warfare went back to the war years, and especially to the context of the defeat of June 1940. The leadership of the organization was entrusted to a member of parliament from the Parti Radical Jean-Paul David. Nevertheless, the Peace and Freedom organization was placed on the registrar of private associations. So it's ran by the government, but they listed it as private, which is kind of gives you the same model that was later adapted here, where you have the publicly funded organizations listed as private organizations. These are the precursors to them. The same tactic happened with the VFF in West Germany. The Volksbund, ostensibly a civil society organization, was put to use as the strong arm of the government, particularly in the Ministry of All German Affairs. Unlike the Peace and Freedom, which was led by a politician, the protagonists of the VFF were or had been close to government circles and took advantage of the connections that they had inside the intelligence circles. This was particularly so in the case of the founder of the organization, Eberhard Taubert, Taubert. He was a former executive of the National Socialist Ministry of Propaganda. In 1933, he had He had created the association similar to VFF called the Anti-Comintern. The anchoring of the VFF at the heart of a state apparatus was made possible by an extensive anti-communist consensus that had reigned in Bonn, built particularly around the Christian Democrat Party, which is one of the leading parties, and its extended network. A key figure for the VFF was its vice president, Arthur Ruppert, Ruppert. He was a journalist. He also was a Christian Democrat Party militant. He had participated in the party's reconstitution in Hamburg and all across the British zone, making him a key contact for Konrad Adenauer because he was basically one of his lieutenants. Both organizations were direct products of the Cold War. Their roots traced back to the anti-communism of the interwar period and throughout the Second World War. Peace and Freedom certainly counted former members of the resistance among its ranks. Pierre Rostini, Rostini, and other militants from an organization called the Rassemblement du Peuple in France, who switched to the anti-communist struggle, also to rely on the networks of Boris Souvraini, and I'm going to spell that last name, Souvaraine, who was the former founder of the Communist Party in France and head of the Comintern, who had broken with Stalin in the 1920s. Now, if you guys have been following along for a very long time, you're going to notice that a lot of the fascists used to be communist. Just saying. Because at the end of the day, they're all totalitarian in nature and all love big government. So they're going to jump on whichever bandwagon has the most momentum at any point in time. And they really don't have anything other than the end goal of one world government at the heart of all of their actions. So they don't really care what you call them. If you want to call them a communist and then you want the pendulum swings and you want to call them anti-communist or fascist, that's all fine with them because they're still headed down the same road. In the 1950s, Souvraini reactivated an organization called the Institute of Social History, an anti-communist documentation center that he had founded in 1935. Jean Paul Davis also relied on a guy by the name of George Albertini, Albertini, who was a socialist from the 1930s. So we have it all covered. We've got the social democrat, we've got the socialist, we've got the communist. They're all in it. So he went from being a pacifist to a syndicalism to collaboration as his philosophy of the day. He was also the right-hand man of Marcel Detat, D-E-A-T. As for the VFF, it combined displaced persons from the former German territories to the east with former National Socialists who had already been active in the anti-Bolshevik struggle. Taubert was determined to form a federation of anti-communism and revive the former anti-Comintern. So in July of 1947, Taubert, just over 2 years previously, had been the right-hand man of Joseph Goebbels, Goebbels, had approached the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps with a, quote, project for action and organization, unquote. So in February of 48, he repeated the initiative. this time with Robert Murphy, the political advisor to the American occupation forces. Taubert was hoping to profit from his experience and establish new networks with the Americans. By the time the BFF was formed in 1950, he was surrounded with veterans from the Nazi Ministry of Propaganda and a core group from the press services of the Nazi Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was also helped by two individuals who had been active in the anti-Bolshevikism since the 1920s. The writer Jürgen Hahn Butry, Butry, so he has a hyphenated name, HAHN-Butry, and a intelligence officer, Fritz Kramer, both of whom would later be in charge of the BFF. Their political background and militant experience was perfect for what they were building. Both John Paul David and Eberhard Taubert wanted to take the fight to the international stage. Taubert's anti-Comintern was already nourishing this ambition within the framework of a collaboration with Entente International Anti-Communiste from Geneva. That's abbreviated EIA. It was also this Entente International Anti-Communiste was part of the Catholic Pro Deo network. The foundations for a global anti-communist organization with national sections modeled on the Entente International had even been laid down at the time of a Congress in November 1936. After the Second World War, all of the plans of Taubert proposed to the Americans comprised of this former project. That former project, by the way, was embraced by the Nazis. And it looks exactly like the Madrid Circular that was created in 1950. There are no coincidences. So in early 1948, Alfred Gielen, Gielen, goes to Geneva. His former colleagues of the Ministry of Propaganda, who had become an agent for the Galen organization, meaning he's Operation Gladio. He is working for the BND, Reinhard Galen, a Nazi. Gielen would later become head of the international section of the VFF. Gielen's trip was supposed to reactivate the link with Prodeo. The activities of John Paul David, something of a new arrival among all of the anti-communist professionals and also Nazis, obviously attracted the interest of others, particularly in the US. The Peace and Freedom organization was approached by a small anti-communist group called Resistance Occidental, RO, that was set up in 1951 in Germany around a guy by the name of Bernd, B-E-R-N-T, Engelmann, E-N-G-E-L-M-A-N-N, which aimed to create an information bulletin for the press under the aegis of an international committee for European movement for resistance to Bolshevikism. In December 1950, it also came to the attention of a similar organization in Switzerland, which was called CSAC, CSAC, which was led by Mark Edmund Chantre, C-H-A-N-T-R-E. Following these meetings, at the behest of the CIA, David promoted the creation of several new peace and freedom organizations in all of Europe. There was one founded in Italy in 1951 by Giulio di Marzio, an employee of the propaganda office for the Marshall Plan, who was attached to the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and whom Jean-Paul David had been directed to by the Italian authorities. At the end of spring 1951, Peace and Freedom Committee was also set up in Brussels under the leadership of Marcel Pasternosa, president of the World Committee of Political Refugees from Central Europe. There was one in Belgium called the CIDCC. The true architect of the Belgian wing, however, was officially created for October 51 by two guys, Marcel de Roover, Roover, and Maurice, I'll spell his last name, Keyarts. De Roover had run the Society of Politics and Economics, a private anti-communist organization that represented the Belgium section. And from, at the start of 51, he served as Jean-Paul David's intermediary in the creation of a Dutch Peace and Freedom Committee under the leadership of E.P. Van Dam van Isselt, Isselt, who happened to be secretary of the Benelux Committee of the Trilateral Cooperation Group. So, as you can see, this is basically one of the organizations, because NATO in the later part of the 40s is just getting its legs under it. So they are setting up a civilian / government entity to coordinate Operation Gladio activities, is basically, and ironically, they're calling it Peace and Freedom. So the contacts were established between Peace and Freedom and the VFF. Several indications seem to imply that the alliance between the two organizations started to take shape in November 1950, following the approach by Engelmann. In Bonn, in May of 1951, they had preliminary meetings around the Christian Democrat executive, Rudolph Junges, for the creation of the German part of it. David must have sanctioned these talks because a follow-up meeting took place in Paris 2 weeks later. David invited the Italian representative, the Swiss representative, to that meeting, and the leadership of the VFF, as well as Engelmann. They agreed to cooperate more closely, still informally, since a contract association was judged as premature. This cautious approach was abandoned shortly afterwards, however, as a European Committee of Peace and Freedom was set up in San Remo in August of 1951 during a Congress that they had there. So then you had French, German, Italian, Dutch, Belgium, all collaborating basically in Operation Gladio. So Jean-Paul David is playing a leadership role because he becomes, as a result of this meeting, the Secretary General. David also prepared an agreement protocol and an internal ruling determining relations between them and any other organization they were going to collaborate with in the network. The protocol succinctly laid out the aims of the committee. Quote, links of solidarity and a permanent flow of exchange to coordinate the activities of these organizations, give rise to communal actions in the defense of peace and freedom. It otherwise underlined the means for action, coordinated poster campaigns, along the same themes, information campaigns using brochures, tracts, and common slogans, and the publication of an information bulletin. Membership was open to new organizations, subject to certain conditions that they commit to the defense of freedom and democracy as their priority, which, understanding what that means, they don't want peace or democracy. Okay. The General Secretariat had to carry out the decisions that were taken, including centralizing all the documentation, maintaining finances, and convening quarterly meetings. And keep in mind, this what I'm describing to you, which I find completely fascinating, is the precursor to the ACC and the CPC that gets housed in NATO, the Allied Clandestine Committee and the what was the CN Clandestine Planning Committee. Those two organizations basically take over the duties of everything that we're talking about here. In the Committee for Europe, there was a huge expansion under David's leadership. He worked towards the foundation of freedom and liberty committees down to the region level. He also made it possible to establish a Danish section through the transformation of Danish society for the Atlantic Pact in Democracy, an organization created several years earlier by former non-communist members of the Danish resistance. Then they started traveling to Scandinavia. They went to Oslo and several of the other Scandinavian countries so they could set up their equivalent. They also, surprisingly enough, set up a Turkish committee. So Jean-Paul David, so it's looking exactly like NATO, just like Operation Gladio. At the time of David's visit to Ankara in December 1952, in a very similar fashion, David secured from the Greek Prime Minister, Marshal Pepagos, the formation of their version of this, which joined the European Committee in December 1952. Then it talks a little bit about the Switzerland one and the controversy, because they're neutral and blah, blah, blah. David was also involved in the resurgence of an organization called Pace Liberty, whose financial resources were running out, and they basically wanted to fold it into this organization. And they reactivate it, and they do so with a guy by the name of Count Edgardo Sogno, Sogno. He just so happens to be a diplomat and a former officer who David had met at a NATO meeting in 1952. What would David be going to a NATO meeting for? David's deputy by 1953 was a guy by the name of Pierre Rostini. He solicited the British authorities to set up their version of this. In March of 1952, the date of admission of a Vietnamese committee? Well, that's only because they're still a French colony, remember? So, all of this is getting set up to create a quote-unquote global front for this anti-communist effort. The financing of the committees were ensured, get this, by subsidies originating from industrialists. What? You mean the oligarchs are funding this? Yeah, just like the Rockefellers, as Paul Williams talks about in his book Operation Gladio. Yeah, those industrialists. And also employer associations and political parties. Dang, that's starting to look just like NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, right? The industrialists with the Chamber of Commerce, the unions, or um, employer associations, trade associations, um, and political parties, just like the Republicans. And damn, that looks exactly like NED. Huh, that's so weird. Notably, these funds serve to mask the provision of aid from the United States via the CIA and the Marshall Plan counterpart funds. All starting to make sense? Support given to these peace and freedom networks fell under the clandestine operations sanctioned by the Psychological Strategic Board to combat communism influence. It was referred to as the Psychological Strategy Board, PSB. PSB D14 was set up for France. PSB D15 was set up for Italy. PSB D21 was set up for Germany. Through this framework, CIA subsidies was transferred to the national committees. The Peace and Liberty also benefited from additional funds intended for international committees, which were used to assist the formation of new organizations. That's crazy. Okay, so now that we've got the organizations and we've got their funding and we've established the fact that it is basically Operation Gladio and it's being funded by the CIA and the Marshall Plan, just like Operation Gladio, let's move on. The network decided in May 1951 to launch the poster campaign with denunciation of Soviet camps. For your holidays, visit the USSR, Country of Freedoms, in a kind of like a satire. Here's another one. Make the most of the holiday camps of the Soviets. So they basically were calling it, like, instead of going to summer camp, they were calling it the Soviets camps, making fun of them. And it basically, in that Soviet camp that they're advertising you go visit as a tourist, they had Nazi concentration camp images on the posters. You know, the ones they did, because these are Nazis, guys. These are Nazis. They're making fun of the Soviets projecting what they did to people onto the Soviets. It's just crazy. Both, let's see, French, German, and the US was collaborating on these efforts. And it says the New York Times was to use part of the poster campaign to illustrate an article on communist domination in Hungary. The VFF, aware of the obvious associative imagery, preferred to keep only the blank silhouettes in order to distance itself from the legacy of the Nazis by adding bell towers of the Kremlins to render the enemy more clearly identifiable. You know, because somebody might actually recognize it as the Nazis that are currently creating this campaign. Can't let that happen. That would ruin your psychological operations and your propaganda. So Talbert resorted to the myth of the quote unquote Soviet paradise in literature that he wrote, while depicting the reality of communism. This spread through the network's propaganda from 1952 on. Why? Another one of the bulletins was, quote, "Why does the USSR, the workers' paradise, not welcome any of the 200,000 Belgium unemployed? Why do men leave this paradise every day?" Unquote. So I'm not going to bore you with the rest of them. You can kind of get the idea. It's just all propaganda. Um, there was a growing cooperation between the national organizations and a common analysis of the international situation. Nobody was allowed off the reservation. So um, they continue to churn out not just posters, they go to stickers, stamps, buttons, and all of them basically were the same, with the same emblems, the same everything, just with different wording for the languages. The background constituted a reactivation of anti-communist themes beloved by Goebbels, thereby doubling the initial message. It also, let's see, peace and liberty organizations ought to, quote unquote, promote a Western peace founded on European heritage, which would be colonialism, by the way. The word peace began appearing everywhere. The map of Europe went beyond any association with the newly formed European coal and steel community by including the British, Swiss, and Swedish flags. The repeating of a slogan for two of the posters showed the importance of peace and liberty according to the construction of Europe and the defense against communism. And they began adding the Scandinavian countries because they all set them up too. They created this kind of propaganda for Stalin's birthday, any kind of holiday that happened in the Soviet Union. They created posters to correspond to that. Okay. So basically, this chapter comes to a conclusion by talking about the towards the middle of 1954, the French security police, after hearing about after hearing from Guilan and the VFF, again signaled that the heart of the international movement, that both Guilan and Jean-Paul David, quote, giving his activity an excessively governmental and NATO characteristic because of all of the meetings and the people that were being brought into this peace and freedom movement, that there was no clear lines between government and the private sector, that they began more and more taking on the onus of being a government organization, which of course is exactly like USAID and all of the others that came after it. Financial controls were introduced by establishing the position of a treasurer, which went to Van Dam Van Issel, followed by the appointment of an honorary president. The nomination of BFF candidate Paul Van Zeelen in favor of David's choice of Gasperi marked a decided shift towards a more militaristic opportunity, and also more along a psychological operation being crafted. So, the Peace and Freedom Organization was intended to build a transnational network geared towards a common anti-communist theme that devolved into a collaboration and support structure for Operation Gladio. And one of the notes I just highlighted talked about several of the people not necessarily mentioned in the chapter were all members of the French Vichy activists, which, as you guys know, they were the people that didn't leave France. They moved to southern France and were basically supporting Hitler during World War II. They also were the ones that gave the most resistance to giving up the colonial possessions in Africa. So they are all part of this peace and freedom, which just to me further cements the fact that this is 100% the precursor to the support structure that gets tucked up into NATO. So, anyway, that's it for today. We can open up the speaker. Trump.
Can I ask, does this not remind you of the Office of what was the one you just went over with Alpha?
Office of Public Safety or the Peace Institute? No, it's
the public safety.
Well, the public safety was more militant. They are the actual ones that were killing people. The Institute of Peace is exactly like this. That's the one we did last week, the Institute of Peace. Yeah, it is exactly like that. And thank you for bringing that up, Bridget. That is an astute observation. This is the precursor to the Institute of Peace. It's all Orwellian.
That's just crazy.
Because remember, the Institute of Peace funded the Albert Einstein Institute, which was regime change.
They just give birth. It's like an evil animal that gives birth to more evil animals and more evil animals. You know, just, and they give each other awards. And that is just, it's disgusting and hysterical at the same time.
Well, what I find the most interesting about this is, so, you know, when we first started, it all sounded so crazy, right? When we first got into this and we did the third way and we heard just the mention of a stay behind unit, and then we looked it up on Wikipedia and I was like, what the hell is that? And then of course the first book that comes up on Amazon, which is my go-to, is to buy a book, not research stuff on the internet. I bought Paul Williams' book. And the more I read of Paul Williams' book, the more flabbergasted I was. But still, there's some little piece of me, even today, that wants somebody to go, no, honey, you have it all wrong. That's not what all of that was. It's not going to happen. But there's still some part of me that is just so incredulous that this happened and it was allowed to go on for so long, that every time you find a book that in most cases, other than the fact that this one says anti-communism on the front of the book, it doesn't just talk about the pieces that you already knew. They all add some new part of it, which allows you to have a more, unfortunately, more confirmation that you absolutely know what you're talking about, but also a more in-depth understanding of how it all came about. And it's just so amazing to me.
It colors in the picture.
Yes.
It's like putting this puzzle together, and as the more puzzle pieces you add, you start to get an idea of what it's going to be, and then it just keeps getting bigger and more detailed. I do have a question from over on the Rumble chat.
Okay.
Craig Muttley wanted to know, Colonel, did you happen to know a Karen Hollenbach or Karen Harned during your career tenure?
Not that I remember.
Okay. That was the question.
Yeah, I don't remember that name. Okay. What else we got?
Come on, Stella.
They are total freaking parasites. They need to be wiped off and exterminated from this planet. I mean, over and over again, it's the same thing over and over again, whether it's within the government, causing wars, stealing resources, and it's still going on today. And they're just freaking parasites, and I can't wait till they're all gone. Bam.
And they keep talking like NGOs are a new thing, and they're not. because that's, you know, what a lot of we're uncovering.
Exactly. And you know, and that's the other thing, you know, like everything you're talking about that happened, you know, back in the 50s and stuff like that happened, you know, and having to, you know, say these are like the real Nazis, not the ones that they're portraying on the news, because the news is still nothing but propagandalized and stuff like that. It's just, it's absurd. People need to wake up. And then seeing how expensive it is, you know, like you said, you know, like whether it's USAID or any of these other things that they did, and they all have like little projects on them. They have like these cute little catchphrases for names. They're just freaking parasites.
Yeah, the names are always the exact opposite of what they are. Illini, go ahead.
Hey, Colonel. We've talked a little bit about, you know, some of the citations. I agree with you that, you know, when I looked at not the Ganser book, but the Paul Williams book, and I tried to run the sourcing for the Rockefeller funding for the CIA to ground. Williams cited a 1983 paper by John Judge. John Judge cited Carl Oglesby in his book, The Cowboy-Yankee Wars. Carl Oglesby cites Carroll Quigley, but they don't actually get into the $200 million, you know, grant there. I'm wondering, do you know what you also mentioned Daniel Ganser? I'm curious if there's something that we can run the ground there. I agree with you that Rockefeller was absolutely instrumental in the start of the CIA. Where I mean, you can see it from, you know, the Dulles brothers and the other people in the Rockefeller organization joining. Where it would be great to get a citation though from Ganser.
Well, he's on X. Ask him. You want me to ask him? I'll ask him.
Oh, I'll see it. Okay, I'll go out and I'll buy the book and I'll see if I can find the footnote first. I was just wondering if you knew that.
Well, I have the book.
Okay.
I can look in the book. Hold on. I'm looking at what they footnoted here about the industrialist. It says the documents proving this remain classified, but there are allusions and statements that attest that many documents held in German and American archives, and then it says a whole bunch of German words. And evidently that's a German book that was printed in 1984. It says there are a note for the CIA under Dr. Otto Lenz, Lenz, State Secretary of the Chancery, and then a whole bunch of more German words that had formerly been classified as secret. Then it also references a memorandum of conversation that was listed as a former document that was classified at the top secret level. Then it says there was a dispatch number 1074 from the U.S. Embassy at The Hague to the Department of State on 23 March 1953 that was originally marked confidential.
Okay, that's awesome. We've got it. That's terrific.
So
the other thing that I'm working on is, okay, so with the Rockefellers, you get back to the roundtable groups, and then you get it back to Lord Milner. And you can trace it that far back. And you've obviously got the Anthony Sutton book, and Anthony Sutton is citing, you know, documents from Lord Milner saying that he's going to be supporting the Bolsheviks in the Bolshevik Revolution.
Right.
Lord Milner is this UK guy.
Right.
Where I'm also struggling right now is trying to get it back to the Fabians. I know that Lord Milner was part of this eating club. And if there's anybody in London, there's something that we can track down that would basically be, you know, a contemporaneous record, basically proving what was going on behind the scenes. So there's another interesting research project out there.
All right. So let me see if there's an easy reference to Rockefeller in Ganser's book. No, there's not. He's got some references to FDR So I'll have to go back through his book and my notes on that, which I will do. And then let me see if there's, what were you looking? That's not the right one. Let me see if I have Cynthia Chung's book here real quick. Yeah, right here. You wanted to know about, what did you want to know about Milner?
I read through the references in Cynthia Chung's book, and she talks about Milner being a member of the Fabian Society, among with a few others. If you go through the Carol Quigley book, and if you go through the Fabians book, which is by, I think, Edward Pease, Milner isn't actually a member of the Fabian Society. He's a member of this eating club called the Coefficients.
Right. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
This is their outer. This is their. So the Fabians tried to form a partnership between the Fabians practice imperial socialism. Basically, we're going to basically go throughout the British Empire. We're going to take over all these countries, and then we're going to establish socialism in there and take care of people. Interesting kind of strategy, okay, but this is what they were. This was, and what they were doing is they were trying to do this outreach to some of the various imperialists out there, including Lord Milner, who was kind of the head of the UK deep state in the 1900 to 1920 period.
Right. So
but
in some of these cases,
find on this.
Yeah, in some of these cases, if you, it's the same thing with the 120 Broadway. So they were very good at how they hid behind veneers. So if you read Anthony Sutton's book, you understand that 120 Broadway was much bigger than a building. It had the dinner club in it. It had the New York Fed. It was where Roosevelt's law firm was at some point. And basically all of the people, though, the Warburgs, everybody that was the who's who of the early 1900s, all resided in some way, either on a board or their office was there. And so you are not necessarily always going to say, oh, okay, so here's a group, and let's just say it's the Fabian Society. All of the people that were working behind the scenes on the round table concept of the Fabian Society of one world order and everything that they stood for is not going to be a member of the Fabian Society. They are going to be members of these dinner clubs because obviously back in the day, that's how they all coordinate. It's like being on boards now, or in social clubs or golf courses or whatever. They are, but the dinner clubs was something so unique because I've read quite a bit about them, and they were very, very strict in your dress code, but they were actually, because they were all men, they actually were whorehouses too. It was a way of compromising it. You honestly get the so Warhamster and I have kind of come to the conclusion that the whole ritualistic aspect of Skull and Bones is that you have to compromise yourself and give them compromising material on you in order for you to be allowed in there so that they can control you for the rest of the time. These dinner clubs were basically a very similar form of that, where you went there and you did things that you never wanted anybody to know, and everybody in the dinner club knew you did them, so you could never tell on them, and then they never told on you. And so tying people to these dinner clubs is basically like saying they're part of the Skull and Bones. And then when you look at the Skull and Bones, as Warhamster and I have, over the period of decades and decades and decades, and they're all in all of these leadership things, and they're basically behind the scenes and not necessarily always the most prominent positions, they literally control everything. So yeah, I agree with you that, and I applaud you for doing what you're doing, because it's definitely critical that it get done. But it also, you're not always going to find a solid line. Sometimes you're going to find a dotted line, is my only caution. And I know you know that, but I want everybody to understand that.
We're not going to find a smoking gun, but there might be, some smoke.
There's enough circumstantial evidence with all of the stuff presented that that's the logical conclusion.
I mean, I'm definitely with you to the idea that these eating clubs and stuff like that seem to operate a lot like fraternities.
They do.
We've seen that, here in the U.S. How deep the rabbit hole goes, I don't know. It probably goes deeper than your average fraternity, though.
Yeah, and we will never know because they don't talk. As a matter of fact, the only way we even knew anything about it is the one that I forget the name of it, that leaves the magnolia on the grave. You don't even know they're in it. The only way you know is when they die, there's a magnolia left on the grave. That's how secret that one is. So I forget the name of that one. All along, go ahead.
Yeah, Colonel, on the, can you hear me? Oh, crap. You can't hear me?
We can hear you.
Can anybody hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, good. I'm sorry, because I'm on my phone and it doesn't normally work there on my phone. But anyway, on the subject of our beloved Nelson Rockefeller, I would, we know about the book Thy Will Be Done, which is, a priceless must read, in my opinion, which I've endlessly recommended until someone has forgotten to shoot me. There's another stunningly, somehow equally as good book by an author named Carrie Reich, R-E-I-C-H. Carrie Reich, R-E-I-C-H. It came out in, I'm pretty sure the same year, 1996. And get this, the author, I think I mentioned this a zillion years ago, but the author was 48 years old at the time. He's on a book tour for volume 1, which ends in 1958. Okay. And then he dies on the book tour. And I'm telling you, I challenge anyone here, read volume 1 of Carrie Reich's Nelson Rockefeller bio, published in 1996, and just like, you can't help but wonder, where is Carrie going here in volume 2? Because I'm sorry, Nelson's doing Dallas, and Carrie is, you can sense that Carrie is getting increasingly suspicious about Nelson Rockefeller in volume 1, and then he dies. Om More Yoga. Seriously, it's a stunning book. But the other comment I just wanted to make is, it's not directly related to, Colonel, what you were talking about, but it's just that I think that it's really important, especially in these like 1946, 1947, and 48 years, to constantly bear in mind, as say, the CIA is using the Marshall Plan to instill the CIA in Europe. What is going to constantly go back and look what's going on domestically in terms of U.S. politics. And you got to do that because it's just like, it makes so much sense, because how can the CIA, take these tremendous leaps in the growth of their power in Europe if they're not, doing the same thing here? And they really are. You can see it in myriad ways, but I'm just like, the book I'm reading right now is it's about Ronald Reagan and MCA, the Music Corporation of America, and it's just like you see what was being done by, the unions in Hollywood that were kind of, to some degree, challenging the oligarchy. As I said, we know that unions are going to be kept under thumbs of oligarchs, or they'll be shot or whatnot. And because at the end of World War II, there was a flare-up of some degree of union democracy, God help us. But don't worry, Colonel, I'm not denying, it was immediately repressed using the powers that be. And of course, in this book about Ronald Reagan and MCA, you can really see that, and how they use the Teamsters as a kind of wild card, to repress the more democratic elements of the unions in Hollywood. And it's just like, Hollywood is like a megaphone, and they were recognizing that if you allow a megaphone to go off script from the oligarchs, it's potentially dangerous. There were some signs of some folks going off script, and they were dealt with, and you see it so clearly in MCA and Ronald Reagan's relationship in 1946 and 47. We have one megaphone in this country, and if there's going to be signs of pluralism here and there, and then they're going to be killed or plane crashed, and Hollywood is such an important megaphone. And it's just very interesting to really correlate that this is all going along while, CIA is using the Marshall Plan to create their Europe.
So what you're saying, in addition to everything you did say, is that these people that say, yeah, Ronald Reagan was great, and then when you tell them, no, he wasn't great, they say, oh, well, he was great until he got shot, which basically isn't any time at all. And then I mentioned to them about Lew Wasserman and his relationship and his tour as the Screen Actor Guild union, and how basically they just put the people in that are controlled to do what they want them to do. And in any, as you just said, any straying off the reservation is not tolerated. And you may get a warning or two, but then you're just as likely to get killed. So yeah, that's kind of my walking back of the whole, everybody loves Ronald Reagan thing, because you can't, it was very early and it went through the entire time. So anyway, Bridget, go ahead.
Yeah.
Hold on just a second. Bridget, go ahead.
There's a question. Craig Muttley has a question.
Okay.
Was The Brothers by Stephen Kinzinger one of Colonel's books?
The Brothers, but I have not done that book. I think I actually have that book though. Let me look. I have not actually did a book review on it though. Let's see. I'll tell you if I have it or not. Yeah, I have that book. I have not done it yet. That book, by the way, is about the Dulles brothers.
Ooh.
Yeah. It's actually a really good book. But I haven't done it yet. We have so many books to do.
Right? Absolutely.
All right. Long, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah. Regarding Brothers, I mean, it's a good book, but given a choice, I think The Devil's Chessboard is a better book. And also, I'm just trying to encourage people to really spread that book somewhat evangelically, because it's such a great entry-level book for so much, and it has so much. You never see a combination of page turner with like holy crap, why did I never hear about this, even though I do nothing but read Cold War history? It's a true gem. It's incredible.
That is a very good book, The Devil's Chessboard.
Yeah. And the other thing I just wanted to say briefly is, we think of this period, of McCarthyism, as it's sometimes called, in which there's some degree of truth to that, but it's also, as you know, a very deceptive label because, getting back to just how closely the oligarchy had really co-opted both parties by the end of World War II, because, as you know, they put in Harry Truman because they knew that they could control him, and they got rid of the previous vice president because they sure knew they could not control him. And, basically it's like, as this amazing book, as I think I mentioned it before, it's called A Pretty Good Club. It was published in 1978. This is a real gem, and it's published in 1978. It's called A Pretty Good Club. I think I've said that before.
You have.
No, seriously. But basically it's about the high monkey mucks in the State Department, in particularly what's called the Riga Group, was hardcore anti-Soviet, and so most of them are Democrats, right? So if you can't really, the name calling it McCarthyism is pretty misleading, because really it was started by these Democrats of the State Department who put their tabula, Harry S. Truman, so they could rasa all over that sucker, and precisely because they knew they could not rasa on the previous vice president, who they got rid of.
Right. Yep. Definitely lots of good books out there, that's for sure. So many books and so little time. Okay. Do we have any other questions?
Someone just came up, probably has a question. Woohoo.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Sure.
Hi, thanks so much for your work. I really learning a lot. Early on in the movement, probably about 4 years ago, I was made aware of this possibility. So when Reagan gets into office and has all these high hopes and has the backing of the American people, and after the Carter administration, we're starting to feel like we possibly could win again. But then he gets shot. And when he gets shot, at that point, things happen. And I'm not sure if there's something that happened before this, but after he gets shot, then you have the pharmaceutical law that states there's no liability. So I guess what I'm trying to say, and the narrative that I had heard previous, was that Reagan was really never in control, that Bush had taken him down, and he was to do what Bush was to do, what Bush was ordered him to do. So Bush, in fact, probably had more like 12 years than 4. Does that sound like it's any possibility at all in your mind?
So the problem with that is you have to ignore the entire time Reagan was governor and the entire time Reagan was the Screen Actor Guild president to make that argument. And if you look at Reagan's life in total, you're going to find a lot of problems. And for example, what we were just talking about, during the time that he was the Screen Actors Guild president, there was a very important, very influential, very rich guy that ran Hollywood by the name of Lew Wasserman. And that is a relative of Debbie Wasserman Schultz, by the way. Lew Wasserman, while Reagan was a Democrat, was kind of like his benefactor. And so he basically, depending on which story you read, but basically they all collectively say this, they just give different reasons. He installed Reagan as the Screen Actors Guild president. And the reason he did it is at the time there was a segregated, if you had a studio, you could not also have a talent agent. company, because then you can collectively, there's no lines. You'll just give all of your people roles in your movies, and you basically have like a monopoly. And so there was a big giant divider. If you do this, you can't do this. Well, the reason why he installed Reagan in that position is because Reagan turned around and granted him a waiver, and he only granted one waiver, and it was to his benefactor, Lew Wasserman. So Lew Wasserman was allowed to use his talent agents' people in his movies, basically creating a monopoly in Hollywood. And as a result of that, all kinds of things went downstream. So then Lew Wasserman funds Ronald Reagan's run for governor. Lew Wasserman also was Reagan's largest donor on his first run into the presidency. And so that's baggage that you take. And he had some really crazy things go on while he was the governor of California as well. And I would encourage you to go look into that. He did a lot of very controversial things. So I don't buy that argument. I understand why people want to make that argument. And it's plausible, but you have to ignore all of the stuff that happened ahead of time.
Okay, can I ask another question in regards to that?
Sure.
So would you say then the Wasserman cartel, were they on the same footing, you think, as the Getty, Pelosi, Brown, and that whole cartel that's out here?
I don't, well, there's a couple of factions of that cartel, right? For example, if you go back and you look at, and by the way, a lot of those cartels out there have some really strange relationships with intelligence organizations. Some really strange. The entire, there's so many of them. So I was stationed in Los Angeles, and the people that own all of the space businesses out there, the major ones like L'Oreal and all of those, belong in the Wasserman kind of cartel. And then there was, and that was very Hollywood-ish. The Getty cartel was very much in the energy kind of cartel, if you want to call it that. So do they have overlaps? Absolutely, because they intermarry. But I wouldn't put them in the exact same one. I would say that they exist beside each other. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I know that's a mixed bag out here.
Sure. Yeah. Renee, go ahead.
Hey, Colonel. Hey, everyone. Always good to be here with you. Sorry for the background noise. This I would like to direct to Eli and I, talking about Rockefeller and Milner. Recently, I've been doing a lot of digging on Tavistock and Brookings and stuff like that, and how it's all connected to the whole PSYOP BS machine propaganda. And I follow someone on Telegram who does wonderful digging. And I just followed you today, Eli and I, so follow me back and I can DM you some stuff. But I just pulled over and I will read, I copied in my notes, but the Tavistock Institute was secretly, they state this Tavistock Institute was started and funded in 1913 by the British monarchy, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, and the Milner Group. Okay, so there is a connection there, and anyway, can kind of guide you on your way with this person I follow and who does some deep dives and stuff. And then also they mention how the Rockefeller and Ford Foundation funded the Brookings Institute. So there is some connection going back with those guys.
Thanks. That's helpful. It certainly, indicates this certainly appears to be a roundtable group kind of organization.
Exactly.
Tavistocks.
Yep.
Absolutely. They have to psyop the world with their nonsense. It goes back to just the book and the chapter you were saying, Colonel, of everything is kind of an inversion. When they say black, it means white. When they're all psychopaths, they all have these philanthropic groups to make them look good.
That's exactly right.
It's been going on for thousands of years of these secret societies. They have their own religion, their own beliefs, their own system, and we are not privy to that. And so they kind of string us along and dangle the carrot and feed us a bunch of BS, but we're kind of getting their game now. So it's very interesting going back really far in history, and they are connected to the Fabian Society. They're all part of the shenanigans and all the same club and all the same people and all the same oligarchs and royals, etc. that I have found so far doing this.
Yeah. And
okay, that's all. Sorry.
Thank you. No, thank you, Renee. Because again, if you draw the lines of all of these things, like for example, the London School of Economics, that is one of the things that comes up repeatedly. And that is, it was founded by Fabian Society member Sidney and Beatrice Webb. And so again, you're looking at, especially back then, the people that got into that organization was basically like what we think about the Rhodes Society today. They're indoctrinated into this way of thinking, or they don't graduate. Ron, go ahead, and then we'll go to All Along.
Colonel, I have for a long time kind of had this not necessarily a romanticized, but certainly an alternative view of 1930s Germany. And this past weekend I'm working on something, and I came across a Lou Rockwell article that talked about how essentially these deranged leftists use or the Marxists, they use these crazy leftist people to basically cause chaos to ultimately bring in a dictatorship. And obviously that just, is gladio bells, just, like sirens and bells are going off. And I listened to, within this article, there was a couple of videos. One of them was an interview of Anthony Sutton. And, I'm a little embarrassed because I don't remember listening or reading some of this stuff, or I remember it, but I just don't remember it that well because it's been so long. It's crazy to me that we were giving the Soviet Union heavy water, graphite, and aluminum tubing in 1944 before Trinity ever was even fired off.
Yeah.
And my question is were the Rosenbergs a ploy to kind of like make it look like, hey, don't betray us? Because it obviously they weren't the ones that were responsible for giving that technology to the Soviets.
So I don't know whether they were a ploy or not. What I will tell you that I know emphatically is that you are watching the exact same thing that happened in the 1930s and 40s with the Soviet Union, that they turned around and made into the biggest enemy for the next 40 years after that.
Correct.
You are watching the exact same thing happen with China. We lived through them giving every fucking thing to China, moving all of our industry to China, and the exact same time. the exact same time they're doing all of that, they're telling us China's the bad guy. Well, quit giving them all of our shit.
Right, you stole my thunder, because that's kind of where I was going. But another thing that really stood out to me was this interview that he gave. I think it was like 1979, and he was talking about how all the documentation that he had used to craft his books all came from the Hoover Institute. And I've done, I am no fan of Herbert Hoover and all the shenanigans that he pulled, pre-World War II, pre-World War I, and throughout World War I, and how the Hoover Institute essentially was this huge repository of documentation. I had no idea that continued, because he said virtually all the information that he was getting to write those books came from the Hoover Institute. And this is in the 1970s.
So hold on.
And he was talking about the stuff from the 1940s.
But hold on.
So clearly that was not something that was just a one-off. It was a continuous operation.
So hold on.
I just want to say one.
Hold on. Before you finish, I have to say the Hoover Institute, for those of you who don't know, they have miles and miles and miles of boxes that have never been opened, that are still out there, that have never even been looked at. And it is not just Herbert Hoover's documentation that is out there. That was a repository where they want everything to go and rot, so they don't say that they disposed of it illegally or whatever, but it is out there at some point where people will actually find out what it was all about, probably when they have us all in cages, literally. But there's so much shit at the Hoover Institute, it's not even funny. Go ahead.
100%. And I just want to say one thing to Illini. You're so kind not to correct people. The proper pronunciation is Illini. The only reason I know that is I spent about a half a year at Rantoul at Chanute Air Force Base. So anyway, I just wanted to give a shout out to Illini. But thank you, Colonel. And I want to have one more question for you specifically, because there's a couple of things that I want to send to you. Do you prefer videos, or do you prefer like links of research?
Links of research.
Copy that. Okay.
Okay. All along, go ahead.
Yeah, Colonel, I just want to pick up on something, Spatfish, and you were discussing related to, the Ronald Reagan assassination attempt of 1981. And, I'm kind of on the fence about that. I mean, I kind of agree with you that, yeah, it's important to look at Ronald Reagan's background. And, he's obviously didn't just come out of nowhere. And one could overstate certain things about him being like a cowboy out there in the Wild Wild West, etc. Because, however, I think I'm sure y'all have heard of this kind of narrative within the Republican Party of the East Coast Republicans saying, "Yikes! How the hell did we lose that 1948 election?" Oh, right. There's these other people who are not on the East Coast. Whoops. And how they started funding Nixon in 46 actually, but they wanted to grow other parts of the Republican Party, and we know how the East Coast folks gave Nixon that money in 1946, etc. And for a while they used Richard Nixon as kind of a compromise between East Coast versus Western Republicans. But Ronald Reagan was kind of seen as the epitome of the so-called Western Republicans. And so there were some differences there between Western Republicans and versus the East Coast CIA Republicans. And, in particular, what some argue the degree to which they could use like unilateralism in South America just to go in and, because the U.S. was in a weird situation where they're permitting the UN, and yet they just still wanted to go in and take shit from South America as they had in Rough Rider days, right? So some see, there's still a kind of Western Republican difference manifest by Reagan, and perhaps the Reagan assassination attempt was a shot over the bow, as it were, to, by the more CIA Republicans. I mean, I agree with both. I also agree with what you said, Colonels, but I'm just saying, it's worth looking at, I think. It's just worth looking at both sides of that argument.
Oh, absolutely. And I do. They obviously were sending a signal to Reagan. But Reagan, that doesn't make Reagan good. Both things can be true at the same time. So just like when they shot the Pope, the Gladio operators that shot the Pope were from the Turkish Grey Wolves. That's, not even arguable. They were sent to prison for that. It's very well documented that that's who it was. There's pictures of them, the whole 9 yards. They were sending the Pope a message. It was never meant to kill him. They were sending him a message. He was talking to the Soviet Union through Poland, his home country. He was not allowed to do that. He was sending them money, trying to basically, and for a generic way of looking at it, basically trying to buy Poland out of the Soviet Union, per se. There's a lot more to it, but that's just kind of a generic way of saying it. And he was not allowed to do that. He was warned not to do that. He did it anyway, and he was shot as a result of that. That shot was not meant to kill him. That shot was like 2 feet away from him. If they wanted to kill him, these were assassins. If they wanted to kill him, they'd have killed him. And that's what I have always said about Ronald Reagan. These guys have tens of thousands of trained assassins all over the world. If they wanted Ronald Reagan dead, Ronald Reagan would be dead. There's just not even, and it would have happened repeatedly until he was dead if they wanted him dead. They were sending a message. So that's my 2 cents. Okay.
I totally agree with you. It just nothing but shenanigans and look over here, look over there. And they were probably trying to tell him to get back in line. He probably wasn't doing exactly what Bushy Baby wanted him to do.
One of the things that came out of the Reagan assassination was background checks on firearms. A lot of people don't really understand that, but that's what the Brady bill was.
That's true.
Yeah, and so that's a huge deal. I don't know where everybody stands on the Second Amendment, but it doesn't say you can have a firearm unless you
get a background check.
Yeah.
Well, and think about that, because up until that point, we had been a country for 200 years, and that was not a thing. And this is exactly what Operation Gladio is. They commit terrorist attacks in order to push an agenda. That's the entire reason that we're doing this research. Because you go back and you look at all of these events, they all result in something. What is that something? Because whatever that something is the whole reason it was done. Like the Patriot Act after 9/11. They wanted that. So it was already written, but you have to have a terror attack in order to get people scared enough to vote for that, or to give Congress the justification to vote for it. And every one of the terror events drives people to want more government to protect them for safety. If we could only ever realize it's the government doing it, then we would not ask for more government, because we're just going to get more terrorism. Illini, go ahead.
Hey, Colonel, on that sort of front, with the, attacks on the Pope and Reagan and everything else, there have been 2 Senate majority leaders, I think, who've both fallen down a flight of stairs or had some sort of a weird injury at, a meeting at a hotel with various, like at a fundraiser at a hotel, I think. It was Harry Reid and it was Mitch McConnell.
Yep.
Does anybody know who was at these meetings?
I don't.
Okay. I think that's a kind of an interesting coincidence there. that kind of, and if you pair it with these other near misses,
yes,
it might be interesting.
Yeah, you're right. No, that's a great observation. Ron, go ahead.
I don't want to belabor the whole 2A thing, but I mean, if you go back prior to 1934, the 1934 National Firearms Act, which is what governs machine guns, silencers, and short barrel weapons, were supposed to. It was designed to be against sawed-off shotguns. That was created after the Valentine's Day Massacre. And the Valentine's Day Massacre was a big deal back in the I think it was the early 30s.
Yep.
And that's why the ATF went under the Treasury Department, because the taxes that they were collecting for those things were it was revenue collection. So then in 68, I don't know why they passed this in 68, but I'm guessing it probably had something to do with all the rioting as a result of the public destabilization from the Vietnam War, because the 1968 Gun Control Act was essentially that, and that's what created the prohibited possessors thing. And then the next thing was it was 86 when they made no more fully automatic weapons. And if you guys think fully automatic weapons are dangerous, you really need to you need to go fire one and find out. I mean, a 30-round magazine in an AR-15 on a fully automatic is going to last you 2.5 seconds. So, I mean, it's ridiculous to think that it's dangerous, yes, but unless you have a belt-fed weapon, a fully automatic really is nothing except an ammunition waster. Then but Reagan is the one who outlawed all that, and if you and go back and look at what he did in California as governor in the 1960s to the gun stuff and out here. But you just keep going on, and then in '94 when they did the assault weapons ban, which I was a little surprised that Bush let sunset, to be honest with you. But after the Soviet Union collapsed, I mean, we had a flood. 7.62 by 39 ammunition was cheaper than 22 long rifle, because all the Soviet bloc countries were sending that stuff over here in mass quantities for people to buy. Anyway, but going back to the Brady bill, and when they did that, the agency or the non-governmental organization that was working with them to remove that right was the National Rifles Association, the NRA. So, and which to me I call negotiating rights away now. So, but anyway, it's just, I mean, what we have seen over the course of this really long period of time, as a result of what you talk about is the Democrats and Republicans, essentially two sides of the same coin, is less and less freedom of firearm ownership. And if you think about what the founding fathers wrote, when the founding fathers wrote the Constitution, what would they just get done doing? They got done defeating the biggest army on the planet. So why would you think that they wanted to have their citizens to have the exact same weaponry that the military had in the event of a tyrannical government? So, and again, not trying to belabor that point, but that whole thing with Reagan, the potential assassination, and the Brady bill and whatnot, it's kind of I'm a little passionate about that issue, and
I couldn't tell.
I don't think enough people are, and because if people really truly understood, because I mean, okay, the Second Amendment is there behind the First, because the First Amendment means we're supposed to talk our issues through, and if we can't address the government for redress for our grievances, then the Second Amendment is supposed to be there to back that up, and not to be cliche, but as Thomas Jefferson said, people afraid of their government, there's tyranny, and when the government's afraid of their people, there's liberty. So on that note, I will get off my soapbox. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
Sure. Okay. So anybody else? Any questions? All right. We're going to jump off here. I appreciate everybody for being here. And I will see you tomorrow. Take care. And Stellar, I do have to tell you something. I don't know how many times you say something just as I hit the end button. I used to do it to Bridget all the time. Now I do it to you. And so know that I'm not actually cutting you off. I just hear you at the last. I've already pushed the button and you try to say something. I'm like, oh my God, I did it again. So I don't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, I understand. No, it's fine. I just like to I just always like to say, love you guys.
All right. So take care, everybody. See you tomorrow.
Good night, girl.
See ya. Okay, so see you guys tomorrow.